Look very closely at any living cellular organism, and you will see the absolute minimum requirements for life on Earth. To keep the biological engine running, an organism really only needs two things: fuel to burn and a safe environment to burn it in. For a human infant, that equation looks pretty simple. Give a baby a steady supply of milk, wrap them in clean swaddling for warmth, and keep them completely sheltered from disease, and their body has all the raw physical materials it needs to thrive. But what happens when a human body is provided perfect physical nourishment and shelter, yet deprived of invisible, entirely non-caloric inputs? Without the sound of a voice or the comfort of affection, the biological machine fails. The body simply stops functioning. In the year 1211, the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, Frederick II, decided to strip away the noise of culture to find out what language humans were born knowing. He believed that if babies were completely isolated from human speech, they would naturally begin to speak the original language of Eden, perhaps Hebrew, Greek, or Latin. He confiscated a group of newborn babies and handed them over to nurses with a strict rule. The nurses were ordered to feed them, bathe them, and handle them gently, but under absolutely no circumstances were they allowed to speak, coo, or sing to the infants. Complete silence. The emperor thought he was going to hear an ancient tongue. He heard nothing. Despite receiving every physical necessity a growing body requires, the babies never spoke. Instead, one by one, they began to die. A friar who chronicled the event noted that the children simply could not survive without the gestures, clappings, and glad faces of their caretakers. Human interaction, it turns out, is a vital, load-bearing biological nutrient. Take it away, and the human organism cannot physically survive. For centuries, Frederick's cruel test was treated as a strange historical anecdote. Then, in the 1940s, a researcher named Renee Spitz began studying infants in institutions, and science began to catch up. He looked first at a foundling home, where babies were kept impeccably clean and perfectly fed, but due to staffing shortages, rarely held or spoken to. He compared this facility to a prison nursery. The mothers there were inmates, and the physical conditions were objectively worse, less hygienic, with far less medical care. But those mothers were allowed to care for their own babies, talking to them, holding them, and playing with them. By every medical standard of the time, the pristine foundling home should have produced healthier infants. The opposite happened. After a few months of normal development, the silent foundling babies began to physically deteriorate. They stopped reaching for objects, they stopped tracking faces with their eyes, and they stopped vocalizing entirely. This chart shows exactly what Spitz observed, a condition he named hospitalism. Even while physical inputs like calories and hygiene remain steadily at 100%, the actual survival rate of the infants collapses. By age 2, more than a third of the babies in the pristine, quiet foundling home were dead. The surviving children couldn't walk, talk, or even sit up. They had every physical thing a body needs, and they were starving anyway. When a baby is deprived of language and affection, the physical body actively gives up. It requires communication to justify its own survival. That physical mortality is what happens to infants. But what happens if a child manages to endure that extreme isolation into adolescence? In 1970, a social worker in a quiet Los Angeles suburb discovered a 13-year-old girl named Genie. Genie had spent almost her entire life strapped to a child's potty chair in a back bedroom. Her father beat her if she made noise. He barked at her instead of speaking, and for more than a decade, no one had said a single sentence in her presence. By a horrible accident, linguists were staring at the exact scenario Frederick had attempted centuries earlier. They wanted to know if Genie could still learn to speak. To understand the answer, look at this timeline. Linguists refer to the space between birth and roughly age 7 as the critical period. During this temporary window, the brain's neural circuitry is physically wide open, aggressively absorbing language input and hardwiring it into the brain. Genie was able to quickly memorize thousands of individual vocabulary words, but she could never assemble them into proper grammatical sentences. She could say applesauce by store, but never ask, "Mom, can we go to the store and buy applesauce?" The deep architecture of grammar, the ability to connect new thoughts, was entirely missing. The the critical window had closed. Language is not a piece of software you can install whenever you're ready. It is the physical wiring of the brain itself. If the brain is starved of input while the hardware is setting, the neural circuitry required for grammar simply never connects. This requirement for communication defines the architecture of your conscious inner self. In the 1990s, a psychologist named Susan Shala began working with a 27-year-old man named Ildefonso. Ildefonso was deaf, and he had grown up in rural Mexico, completely isolated from sign language. By the time he reached his late 20s, he possessed absolutely zero language. He had no spoken words, no written text, and no signs. Shala spent months trying to teach him that objects have names. When the breakthrough finally arrived, Ildefonso sat in her classroom and wept. But later, when he was finally able to communicate, he tried to describe what those 27 years of silence had been like, and he couldn't. He called the time before language a fog. He had been alive, but he hadn't been able to think about being alive. Without words to lay the memories down with, there is no chronological past. There is no before, no after, and no narrator inside your head. You cannot critically examine your own existence without the structural scaffolding of language to record it. Which brings us right back to Emperor Frederick in the 13th century. He believed that if you stripped away the noise of culture, you would find a pure, uncorrupted, original human waiting underneath. 800 years of clinical science proves the exact opposite. There is no pre-cultural self waiting in the silence. The noise is the self. The lullabies, the half-finished sentences, the way your mother whispered your name when she was tired, the ambient hum of affection poured into your ears before you could understand a single syllable of it. Those ordinary interactions are the literal building blocks that construct a human consciousness. A baby raised in absolute silence does not become a purer human. Take away the words, and the body might keep breathing for a while, but the person never shows up. We are not born human. We are talked into it.